Welcome to the Independent School Podcast with me, Juliet Corbett. As an executive coach and strategy advisor, I guide senior leaders in the world of education to find their strategic focus, empower their teams, and regain control over their time, helping them to go from exhausted to strategic. On this podcast, I share the ideas and tips that I've developed over the years to help the leaders I've worked with one-to-one, so that I can help you to focus on your priorities and achieve your goals with confidence and ease. So if you listened in last time's episode, I shared with you a story from NASA about how they solve wicked problems. And this episode, we're going to be talking about how to solve some of those problems within the independent school sector at the moment. Now, you might want to jump back to the last episode and listen to that one first, but you don't necessarily need to. This will still make sense without having listened to NASA's story first. And then at the end of this episode, I'm going to give you a quick reminder of the announcement I made last time about a new podcast I'm launching and my plans for this podcast going forwards. Okay, so let's dive in. First of all, I think we need to define what we mean by a wicked problem. We are not talking about making a value judgment on the problem itself. It's much more specific than that. It's a phrase that's been used in the academic literature for a couple of decades at least. I think it was the 1970s it was created, which has increasingly been seen within the wider literature as well. So a wicked problem is defined as a problem that has multiple stakeholders, each group having a different set of values as to what they want to see come out as the solution to the problem or the outcome to the problem. And those outcomes that each stakeholder group wants are often contradictory. Sometimes they might be changing over time as well, or be in some way ambiguous or difficult to measure or difficult to pin down in some way. And last time what I kind of said was basically this is what happens when we work with large groups of human beings trying to cooperate together, which is inevitably the situation we have within organisations. We almost inevitably have at least a couple of wicked problems on the go at any one time as leaders, because we're almost always navigating these different requirements of different groups or different individuals, often some of which aren't necessarily that clearly defined. So quite a few problems that we face as a society, that we face within schools, are defined as wicked problems. And last time I gave you an example of NASA trying to create space missions. This is kind of the early stage planning stages of them creating these missions, trying to solve for three contradictory outcomes. They wanted to solve for what the scientists needed, the data the scientists needed. They were trying to solve for making the project engineeringly viable, various different constraints that the engineering has to work with and when you're looking at spacecraft. And then finally, the criteria of cost. What is the budget that they're working within? So what I wanted to do this time was to talk through the three reflection questions that I posed at the end of the last time's episode and talk through each of these questions in turn, specifically from the point of view of independent schools. And although I know that if you're listening from an international school, some of these examples might not be as relevant, but I'm going to root the examples I give this time within the UK sector, where we're seeing the possible addition of VAT being added onto school fees, depending on the outcome of the next general election, which has to be at some point in 2024, and the impact then on affordability for parents. So if you're outside the UK, don't worry, you can adapt what I'm talking about to your sector. I'm going to take that as a case in point, as an example to work through. Okay, so the first reflection question that I posed at the end of the last episode was, what wicked problems are you trying to solve? And what contradictory outcomes do the stakeholders want that makes those wicked? So the obvious example to take is the impact of VAT on school fees. Now, there are multiple different stakeholders at play here, or have a stake, if you like, in the decision of how each individual school responds to the possible addition of VAT to school fees, and basically it being considered as being an uplift in the cost of the education that you offer, even though it's actually a taxation cost rather than the actual core cost of the education. The impact on the parents is going to be that the cost goes up. Now, most schools are thinking and making early decisions around to what extent they might be able to absorb some of that taxation cost increase in order that parents don't have to pay the full 20% elevation in fees that VAT would add. So what that means is that UK schools are looking at where can we cut budgets, basically. And so what's really important is we understand the criteria of the different stakeholders involved in this wicked, in inverted commas, problem. And remember, we're not talking about a value judgment on the impact of VAT. We're talking about the fact that this is a wicked problem with multiple stakeholders. So a couple of stakeholder groups come to mind for me, and you might think of other examples within your school. Every school is going to be unique. But the first stakeholder group that comes to mind is the parents, and the fact that the first criteria that the parents had is that they need to be able to afford this new fee level. So affordability is a definite constraint to solving the problem. And some schools will have parent groups for whom that is a larger constraint, in the sense that affordability is already quite stretched. And some schools will have parent groups where that isn't actually that much of an issue, where the parents can definitely afford to pay, or most parents could afford to pay a higher fee level without necessarily needing to consider whether they're taking their children out of the school. So different schools will have different constraints here, but the first constraint is that the parents need to be able to afford the fees, or at least the majority of the parents need to be able to afford the fees. The second constraint then is that the parents need to choose to pay those fees. Now, this is slightly different. Even if you can afford to pay the fees, parents are affluent buyers, effectively, of a luxury product. Now, we don't always want to describe education in these terms, but what we know of affluent buyers of luxury products is they don't necessarily make decisions on the price point, but they absolutely do make decisions on value for money. We want to make sure that parents see investing in their children's education as providing value for money. Now, this is going to be an important one that comes up later in my discussion of these reflection questions we're working through. Another stakeholder group, obviously, is the pupils. So we know that as educators, as school leaders, we hold very, very dear the fact that we are preparing our pupils to flourish in life. Increasingly over time, we're defining that flourishing in a much more wide way of kind of general human flourishing, to do with well-being, to do with happiness, to do with fulfilling potential. A much wider way of defining this rather than just academic results and then university destinations. We might have been a little bit more fixed kind of thinking earlier, maybe a few decades ago. So this stakeholder group, the pupils, need to have a good preparation to flourish in life. And obviously that can be defined in different ways by the parents, the pupils and the staff, but that is what the pupils need. The third group of stakeholders is then the staff. So the teaching staff and the support staff who are working within the school. And they need to flourish too. We need to be looking at well-being, we need to be looking at work-life balance, we need to be helping them to see how they can continue to work to fulfil their purpose. Most teachers come into the education sector because they have a feeling of purpose through education. And so being drawn off into different directions often makes them feel like the majority of their time, or a substantial amount of their time, is not spent on the core purpose, their core identity of delivering education to young people. So we need to find ways that the staff can flourish as well. And then the other stakeholder group that comes to mind is the school leadership and governors, sort of all in one group probably. And here their key criteria is all of the above. They do care about parents affording fees, they do care about pupil outcomes, they do care about staff, but they also care about the school remaining financially viable in the short, medium and long term. So they care about the financial viability, which often gets simplistically defined as they want to make sure the budget allows the school to operate with a certain amount of surplus that can be reinvested into buildings and so on. We're not looking to make a profit, or at least within non-profit schools, we're not looking to make a profit, but we are looking to make sure that our budgets are controlled in a way that enables us to remain financially viable and thriving, actually, in the short, medium and long term. Now, when we set out these different criteria, it's relatively easy to see that there are conflicts. There are some of these things are in conflict with each other. It may be that we want to provide an education which allows the pupils to be fully prepared for life, and yet some of those things we can't provide that we would like to because the budget just isn't there. We might want to be able to provide all these amazing opportunities, but it's going to push the fee level up beyond what parents are either able to pay or would choose to pay for the school education that their children are receiving. So there are ways to solve this wicked problem, but every solution is going to involve one or more stakeholders not getting everything they want. That's why it's difficult. That's why it feels hard as a leader. That's why it's not easy to find an obvious solution. It is the classic definition of a wicked problem. So I've now identified, having answered question number 1, we've identified what the wicked problem is that we're trying to solve and the contradictory outcomes that the stakeholders that are involved want from the solution to that problem. So the second reflection question that I posed for you at the end of last episode was, what system do you have in place to brainstorm new ways of doing things, to anticipate knock-on consequences, and to revise the plans rapidly? Now, last time I talked about this from the point of view of NASA, and it's pretty obvious that what works for NASA isn't necessarily going to be what works for a school. We need to create a school-based system for enabling us to solve these problems. Now, 2 things come to mind. The first is this system needs to be based on a solid concept of what it is that we're trying to achieve. So if you like, the general way that we want to solve this wicked problem. Now, what I'd like to propose today isn't necessarily the only answer of what concept you want to use to solve this problem, but is a useful concept, I believe, having worked through this with many, many schools. And that is the idea of putting value for money from a parent perspective at the centre of solving this wicked problem. Now, as you'll have heard me say before, there is a lot of jargon in strategy, most of which is not very helpful. There is, however, a really useful framework for thinking about value for money. It's called the strategy canvas. And it was first put forward by some academics who wrote a book called Blue Ocean Strategy. And in this book, the authors presented with a really compelling kind of reason why this is a great way to create a value proposition strategy. They proposed a way of thinking about what your ideal customer cares about. Now, I'm not going to go into immense amounts of detail. The book Blue Ocean Strategy is very readable. There are great audio versions, and I'm sure there are probably YouTube videos that will give you a really comprehensive summary. So go out there and explore if you want to kind of know more about this approach. But at the basic level, what it requires you to do as a group of leaders is to identify, firstly, what are the key things that most schools are offering? What is it that the majority of schools in your competitive environment, whether that's local because you're a day school, whether that's a broader geographical competitive environment if you're a boarding school, what are the things that everybody does, everybody talks about? They're kind of the classic ways that we try to compete in our sector. A few things come to mind as examples. We're talking about there being a fairly large amount of co-curricular activities. We're talking about there being a fairly large, broad range of subjects offered towards the higher end of your school, perhaps in sixth form. And kind of making sure that there is breadth within your offering is normally something that most schools talk about, as well as academic outcomes, the convenience of what could be considered wraparound care, although obviously it's education rather than just wraparound care, but it makes parents' lives easier. The ideas of the alumni network that people buy into, the concept of preparing your children for university and or further career options, all sorts of different things that schools will talk about to varying different degrees. Now, when you plot this out and think about all the different things that you and all of your competitors are doing, you're probably going to see that most schools are doing very similar things. Some schools might dial up the STEM and science a little bit more. Some schools might dial up the creative arts and visual arts a little bit more. But basically, most schools are really similar. Now, the proponents of the strategy canvas, this blue ocean strategy approach, is that the way to really solidify a position within a competitive market, which is what this market is to do something slightly different and to capture the interest of the ideal customers, the ideal families that you want to be really captivated by what you're offering. Now, before you decide what that looks like and how bold you're willing to be in terms of the places that you are investing and the places that you are cutting, you need to really understand what your current parents value and what your future ideal parents value, which may be the same, may be slightly different. Now, most parents, both current and prospective, will give you a very long list of things that they value, things that they are prepared to pay money for. They give them a sense of value for money. What's much harder is to get them to tell you with honesty and openness to rank order those things they're telling you they value in order to identify towards the bottom of that ranking what are the things that, if truth be told, they don't actually value that much, or at least not enough to pay significant extra for in their school fees. Now, this will be different for different parent groups. This will be different for different schools and day schools and boarding schools. There are a lot of unique circumstances which will determine the answer to this question for your school. But let's say, for example, that when you talk to your current parents, you talk to your prospective parents, you do some market research conversations around this, let's say that you discover that, yes, although parents do value the breadth of the co-curricular offerings, they probably don't value it enough to pay an additional, £1,000 a year on school fee. I'm just plucking a figure out of the air. They don't value it enough to say, I'm going to pay an extra amount on my school fee to allow my child to have this breadth of opportunity. Now, if that breadth of co-curricular opportunities comes towards the bottom of the ranked list of what your parents value, then you're probably thinking, okay, this is an opportunity to cut back on this. Obviously, we still want to offer co-curricular opportunity, but maybe we streamline it. Maybe we think about the cost effectiveness of each of the activities that we offer. Maybe we think about how this could be provided with greater economies of scale, combining forces with other local schools or private providers who might be able to provide some of these opportunities with a bit more scale behind them and therefore at lower cost. Do we actually want to pay teachers, which is relatively expensive person hours, quite rightly, because they're highly trained? Do we necessarily think that's the best use of their time to be offering and running co-curricular clubs with a relatively small number of pupils within each group? And these are tough decisions. These involve making cuts where parents don't value necessarily highly enough to pay extra for your standard offering. But the opposite is also true. There are also places where you can invest, where parents do value what you're offering enough. That might be something to do with individualised support for pupils, not just SEND pupils, but wider individual support for pupils. It might be something that your parents are telling you they really care about. So thinking about where you're going to invest and where you're going to cut, but doing it from the concept, the framework, the sort of intellectual lens of looking at value for money. Now, the other half of question 2. So question 2 is, what systems do you have in place to brainstorm new ways of doing things, to anticipate knock-on consequences, and then rapidly revise your plans over time? The first I've put forward as an idea is you need to have a framework through which to consider these difficult decisions. The second thing is much more logistical, much more practical, and that is making sure that you've got the right people in the room discussing the right things. Now, this often will look like working parties or task and finish groups, not necessarily standard committees. but bringing together projects with groups of people who are the right people to discuss these particularly challenging things and getting them to anticipate the knock-on consequences of some of these decisions and opportunities that might be in discussion. And generally speaking, it's a good idea to think beyond hierarchy when you're thinking about who should be in those conversations. I know within schools hierarchy matters and hierarchy is quite important, but actually to get the right voices in those conversations, you're potentially looking for people who are at all levels of the hierarchy, all parts of the school, coming together for focused conversations around some of these tricky, wicked problems that you're trying to solve. Moving on, question 3 that I posed at the end of the last episode, the reflection question: are you and your team ready to embrace change that might feel hard? This is hard stuff. This isn't the easy part of leadership. This is the part of leadership that requires you to listen to multiple stakeholders, to involve people in creating ideas and testing ideas, evaluating them, thinking about knock-on impacts. But at the end of the day, leaders, by which I mean governors as well as the senior leaders within the schools, are going to need to make tough decisions. And sometimes that means stopping doing something that you've cherished as a school community for many years. And the example I gave last time from NASA was they actually had a poster of the 5 stages of grief on the wall to remind everybody it's not easy to let go of things that you really cherish, but sometimes it's the right thing to do. You have to do it to solve the wicked problem and move forward as an organisation. A couple of brief ideas here. One thing that comes forward actually quite frequently when I'm doing executive coaching with senior leaders is talking about the concept of cabinet responsibility. Obviously, this is a phrase that comes from the political world, thinking about the government cabinet that leads the country. Cabinet responsibility requires a robust, open discussion within the closed doors of the cabinet, and then a rock-solid agreement that you will support whatever the decision comes out of that discussion. You will support it both publicly and you will make it happen behind the scenes as well. You will go ahead as if that had been your own idea all along. And I think it's really important when you're thinking about difficult decisions, whether those are at senior leadership team level and or governing body level, this idea of cabinet responsibility is really important. You have the open, robust discussion, but then once you've made a decision, everybody needs to move forward with a united front. And the second thought that comes to mind with this idea of being ready to embrace tough decisions and hard change is the really integral part of the importance of open communication. Now, sometimes, especially if there are conversations around potential redundancies, around potential pensions changes, we cannot necessarily have completely transparent communication. There are occasions where it's completely appropriate and correct that we don't share everything all of the time. As leaders, we have responsibilities to make sure that these information is shared at the right time, to make sure that everybody hears these important messages simultaneously, and that we follow the right legal frameworks for some of these consultations. So it can't always be fully transparent communication, but the default needs to be that we have open communication unless there is a very clear rationale for why we can't at the moment be fully transparent with our stakeholders. So the idea of being able to communicate with real integrity and feeling and honesty, the fact that you can't deliver what everybody wants, the fact that you understand each of the stakeholders' kind of desires and requirements and what they want to come out of the situation, but that you explain the constraints that you're working within. And that will include sharing financial information about your school as well. And then privately, you might share between yourselves that you can't take everybody with you. But the more that you're able to share openly, the rationale behind your decision making, the constraints in which you're working, and show some humanness in empathizing with others in that process, it increases the chance that you will take more people with you as you lead the school through change and through potentially difficult situations. And remembering that you as leaders are responsible for the long-term financial viability and in fact the long-term thriving of your school, for the benefit of current and future pupils, really keeping that in your heart, as it were, keeping that as a central value can help people to make what could otherwise be very, very difficult decisions. So I'm hoping that's helpful. It won't have given you answers for your school, because every school will be unique, every school will be different, but it gives you some of thoughts around those 3 reflection questions which I posed in the last episode, around helping you to create a way in which you can solve wicked problems by firstly defining what makes it wicked, identifying the different stakeholder groups and what they want differently out of the solution for the problem that you face together. Secondly, thinking about the system, both in terms of the logistics of that system and in terms of the mental framework or lens through which you're making decisions. And then thirdly, making sure that you're preparing yourself and your team to make difficult decisions and then deliver those with empathy and humanness, making sure that people are really aware that you have thought through these competing challenges and that you are being as open as you can be to lead your school forwards. I always love to hear your feedback. Please let me know if this has been helpful, what other questions remain in your mind as we wrap up this episode. And a brief reminder of the news that I announced last time about this podcast. So I'm going to be launching a new podcast with my friend and innovation expert, Lucy Gower. We're going to be covering a lot of the same leadership, empowerment, taking control of your time, being a creative thinker, being a strategic thinker. We're covering all of the same topics that I talk about in this podcast, but for a wider audience of leaders. So everything in that podcast is going to be highly relevant to school leaders, as well as a much broader audience as well. And then in the meantime, for this podcast, we're going to be having slightly sporadic new episodes coming out a little bit less frequently than the weekly cadence we had in 2023 and the years before that. And that's partly because I know that the amount of time it's taking me to make this new podcast absolutely exceptional means that I can't divide my time. I've had to make the tough decision of just scaling back slightly on the number of episodes for the Independent School Podcast. But it's also in the honest belief that the end result of that new podcast is going to greatly benefit you all as well within the independent school sector. So that's it for this time. Do let me know if there's anything I can help you with going forward, thinking through these different things as a thought partner or a coach. And just remember that if you're expecting yourself to think strategically, we all need to grant ourselves the space to breathe, the time to learn, and the courage to adapt. Have a strategic week. Bye-bye then.